Good afternoon to our registered guests today. Welcome to another Thompson Co. webinar brought to you by Thompson Co.'s HR Genius. Today's webinar is entitled Pulling Up a Seat, Diversity and Inclusion for Boards of Directors. And as you may have seen on the registration link that went out, we're going to talk a little bit, talk about a little more than that. Especially in today's time, there's been a lot of conversation about diversity and inclusion efforts, as well as equality efforts, and a lot of campaigns regarding what that looks like or what it should look like to the general community. And so we're going to look at how companies are responding or are being asked to respond, and can they actually increase diversity at the board level and or other leadership positions? And will they commit to diversity and inclusion overall? Can they? And what are the legal implications of a targeted diversity effort? So this webinar will seek to address the benefit of diverse boards, case laws regarding targeted diversity, and forecast the possible impact on employment litigation, and provide just some general recommendations for businesses and organizations. My name is Chantel Cheatham, and I'm a partner at Thompson Co. in the Labor and Employment section, and I'm joined today by Hillary Kramer-Lynch, a senior attorney in our section in the Dallas office. And this is an important topic to both of us because Hillary and I have varied experience working with employers. We're both management side attorneys. And Hillary is also very active on a nonprofit board. And so this is something that it means a lot to both of us, and we're just glad to have you here. As I mentioned, today's webinar is brought to you in part by Thompson Co.'s HR Genius. If you're not familiar with it, it is a monthly membership at 3 levels that provides you varied content and advice depending on what you might want to sign up for, including access to the firm's lawyers. We have multiple offices in Texas, but also outside of Texas, in New Orleans, Los Angeles, and St. Paul. The services include a hotline, webinars such as today, updates, various services, and a lot of that includes, a lot of people like to use HR Genius to make sure that their employers' policies and procedures or employee handbooks are up to date. This has been a big year for that, especially given the Supreme Court's recent decision in Bostock. We've been getting a lot of requests for handbook review and revisions, so that's something to consider. And there might be something to look at following today's conversation as well, depending on what your organization may choose to do with regard to a diversity and inclusion effort. So after our introduction today, we will get into the applicable law. If you do have questions, we're limited to an hour today. We may not have time to answer them, but on the last slide, you will have access to our direct emails. So please jot down any questions that you might have and feel free to send them to us following today's webinar, and we will get back to you. So getting into the topic of board diversity and inclusion, some of you might recall back in June, on June 5th, Alexis Ohanian, who is known as being one of the founders of Reddit and also being the husband of Serena Williams, made a public statement about deciding to step down from his position with Reddit. And he did it because he believed it was important to resign and have a Black board member serve the community. And this was in light of a lot that was going on at the time related to the death of George Floyd. There were protests. Now there's continued conversation about diversity and inclusion generally, but that was the tone of the environment when the statement came out. And he believed that his resignation was an act of leadership and that it was important and was really calling on other organizations to follow suit. About a week later, Reddit announced that they were replacing Alexis Ohanian with Michael Seibel, and he became Reddit's first Black board member. In a statement about the decision, Reddit's co-founder and CEO Steve Huffman said that Seibel was one of the few people who has a deep background in tech and knows the challenges and opportunities that the organization face as well as he does. And so they were honored to have him join them. Seibel was already very involved in tech and in that community. He was a co-founder and CEO of Justin.tv, which was the interactive video platform that would later become Twitch. He later sold Twitch to Amazon for $970 million. So he had a lot of relevant experience. They were able to get him to replace Alexis Ohanian very quickly. But this made a lot of news. It was discussed for days. And so it is something that is relevant, obviously, to our discussion today.
Chantal, I was looking into a little bit of Alexis Ohanian's or Michael Seibel's background, and he himself has taken a great interest in searching for cultures and diverse backgrounds to make sure that when he is looking for startups to fund or invest or counsel, he takes a affirmative step at making sure that there is a representation across all countries and backgrounds, socioeconomic. So he himself is also taking a great stand in what he does in his day job and not just as a board member too. So he has a wonderful background, and I think that's a great step for them to continue to use that in their board. Sorry, I'll hand it back off to you now.
No, absolutely. And, you know, and I just want to say too, Hillary and I are having to do this webinar remotely given the state of COVID right now. So I will apologize in advance if we talk over each other. We're doing our best not to. Normally we would do this in person, sitting next to each other. So doing this remotely without the opportunity to see each other makes it a little more difficult. But thank you for that, Hillary.
You're welcome.
So in addition, during this time period, there was a Pull Up for Change campaign that was targeted initially at the beauty industry. And what they sought to do, and a lot of this was on social media, primarily on Instagram, but a beauty founder, a Black woman, was asking beauty organizations, beauty companies to identify publicly the number of Black people in their organizations, really on boards and in leadership positions. And eventually that became much more widespread to include organizations and companies outside of beauty, and also not limited to identifying the number of Black people represented, but also women and other people of color, people of various sexual orientations and identities were also included. One company that decided that they were going to participate in this challenge and share their information was Unilever. And of course, Unilever is known for being the parent company behind a lot of different brands, including Dove, Caress, Lipton, Seventh Generation. And so they identified what their breakdown looked like, and also a commitment to trying to increase their representation of various individuals in leadership, and made a $1 million donation to organizations and activists. At the time, Unilever identified 8% Black representation across the organization and in 17% of leadership roles. Of all of their U.S. corporate employees, 30% identified as people of color, and more than 50% identify as women. And what's interesting about this is at the time that this Pull Up for Change challenge started, the number of large brands that participated, as I mentioned, were initially in beauty. If you go to their Instagram page now, you will see that for organizations that have not voluntarily disclosed, there are people who are looking into public companies, large companies, and sharing that information for them. They're really bringing companies to task to say, if you are not going to be transparent, individuals are going to research where they can, whether that be on company websites, through social media pages, what their representation, what their leadership looks like. And so community members, consumers at large, are really looking to see what these companies are doing. And why does this matter? Why is diversity important? And I'm going to pass it off to Hillary to talk about that for a second.
Yeah, and a lot of the Pull Up or Shut Up campaign has been a public accountability campaign. Back in 2009, the SEC recognized that diversity is important for financial decision making, for funders, but the SEC does not require companies to report voluntarily or involuntarily, it's not mandatory, about their diversity strategies. They can voluntarily disclose whether or not they have any type of diversity programming or training, but they're not required to explain what that is or how they define diversity. And the SEC also does not require them to report about the board makeup. So this public accountability of making these companies disclose their diversity makeup is a huge campaign, because they are not required to do it. But as we understand, and this campaign is trying to raise awareness of, diversity is very important when you are looking at either as a nonprofit board or a for-profit corporation. Who are your consumers? Who are your clients? Who are you serving? What is the community interest in your organization? And if the makeup of your board is so skewed and does not represent your customers, your clients, or the community, then what really is the mission and purpose of your organization? And with respect to that, when you bring in this diverse mindset and all of the different perspectives from different stakeholders, then you are going to be better able to access resources in the community, because many donors or funders are the result of networking or connections from your board members. Also, when a board is asked to respond to, for example, Pull Up or Shut Up or other types of challenges facing the organization, they're going to be much better equipped to respond if they have perspectives that are both wide and deep with respect to challenges facing certain socioeconomic people, gender, and race. So they will be better equipped at responding to those different challenges and external influences. And also a diverse, yeah, go ahead, Chantel.
Oh, no, I think absolutely. I agree with you 100%.
Okay. So this is one, just a change that not is to placate any one group or challenge, but it makes all of us better. It strengthens the company or the nonprofit, and it helps the organization because of the top, because they're toning at the top and they are setting the tone culturally for that organization. Generally, when you have a diverse group of board members, they are going to come with different skill sets, and how they look at a problem and address it, or how they face challenges, or how they strengthen an organization is going to be in harmony much greater than if it was just one mindset, status quo that continues to be the historical precedence of what had been happening and continues to happen. There always needs to be a fresh outlook, and a diverse set of board members will help steer that to a more strategic and wide array of assessing different challenges and meeting certain decision making. And that also
absolutely. And so with that, I was going to say, so with that in mind, where companies are looking to that now and they see the benefit and they want to make changes and they see them as valuable, the question is, what can they do to increase diversity within their company, their business, their organization? Can they do that legally? And so today we're talking about the boards, we're talking about the people at the top, but we're also talking about potentially high-ranking leadership positions within the company or organization when you have your C-suite individuals. It's really going to come down to whether or not that person's a volunteer, if they're an independent contractor, if they're an employee. A lot of people are familiar with Title VII. We see cases involving claims of discrimination, disparate impact, failure to hire, failure to promote related to Title VII all the time. For those who may not be familiar, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes it unlawful for an employer to discriminate against an individual because of the individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and incorporates a standard of but-for causation. And this year that was extended to include sexual orientation and identity under sex. And when making a claim then of discrimination or, a hostile work environment or anything under Title VII, when you're looking to one of those categories of protected class, those are often also the types of groups that these organizations are looking to see an increase in their ranks, to see minorities of all different types be better represented, to increase that diverse thought. And so in most cases, Title VII will prohibit employers from making decisions based on an applicant or employee's protected status. The only legally recognized exception is when employers establish affirmative action plans based on a historical imbalance or disparity in the workforce. These plans are typically permissible when preferences are intended to eliminate conspicuous racial imbalances in traditionally segregated job categories. While doing that, the rights of non-minority employees cannot be unnecessarily trammeled, and the preferences are temporary in duration. And this is from a Supreme Court case in 1979, so this is not new. Even though people might be taking another look at what that conspicuous racial imbalance might be within their organization. And even though it might seem like common sense that courts would support affirmative action plans, in practice, courts really scrutinize these plans very closely. For example, there was another case, Shore versus Resorts International, where a Caucasian plaintiff alleged that he was denied a technician position based on race when the job was offered to an equally well-qualified minority candidate. That was in 1999. And under the Casino Control Act, the employer was required to take affirmative steps to employ minorities. At that time of the hiring decision, the technician category was 22.5% minority compared to the regulation's goal of having 25% minorities in the position. So the employer believed it was obligated to hire the minority applicant. And in that case, the court held that the employer's affirmative action plan still violated Title VII because it was not based on a finding of discrimination in the casino industry or the technician job category, and so was not put in place based on a historical imbalance of disparity in the workforce. This shows that this shows a significant challenge facing employers. Even being well-intentioned, you have to still be very careful to make sure that you're complying with Title VII. So employers that are considering affirmative action plans must ensure that they meet all the required factors that were highlighted on that last slide. And while there's no bright line rule, that can make it difficult, but that's just the importance of making sure that you engage experienced counsel in determining whether or not the racial or the gender makeup of your organization would justify making such a targeted diversity effort. So courts have made it clear that any non-remedial affirmative action plan aimed at promoting diversity rather than remedying discrimination could be in violation of Title VII. Sorry, we skipped that last slide. It went blank for me for a second.
Yeah. Let me get back to it. I apologize.
No problem. It went blank, and so we skipped to the next one, but it looks like it's loaded now. And so looking at that Supreme Court case from 1979 that was referenced previously, United Steelworkers versus Weber, that was the one that really outlines the standards, the threefold test for identifying if you can have a targeted diversity effort, or as they call it, these affirmative action guidelines. And this is a Supreme Court case that the EEOC has adopted in enacting its voluntary affirmative action guidelines. And so, again, that voluntary plan to address lack of diversity can be lawful if it is designed to eliminate manifest imbalances in traditionally segregated job categories, does not unnecessarily trammel the interests of non-minority workers or create an absolute bar to the advancement of non-minority employees, and is a temporary measure to eliminate a manifest racial imbalance, is not intended to maintain racial balance. These same standards apply under Section 1981 as well, so it's not just Title VII. One thing to consider, though, in making that determination whether there's been a historical imbalance that needs to be corrected, I mean, if you're looking at an industry as a whole versus maybe your organization's history, that might be a little bit easier. But if you are acknowledging that your organization or your company has historically had groups underrepresented, especially if there's any sort of admission that that was intentional, while you might be able to lawfully correct it, you also may be admitting to failure to hire or discriminating against those minority candidates in the past. So you also want to be careful in how you articulate the reason for creating that diversity initiative now. Something to consider when doing that is when the last claim was made, when the last minority applicant was denied a position, when the last minority employee was maybe not selected for a promotion or a transfer. Look at your EEO reports filed with the EEOC to see what those numbers are currently, to see if there have been any charges under Title VII, if there have been any demands made under Title VII or 1981. You don't want to be in the midst of trying to litigate a discrimination claim and then, and on the other hand, seek to remedy that and just have that admission worked against you. And even if you can lawfully try to increase diversity within your company or organization, you will inevitably, unfortunately, you can see claims of reverse discrimination. And this is in all sorts of businesses. I have personally had to defend a case where there was a gentleman who claimed that he was not promoted or that he was terminated because he was a white male and he was a white female was favored over him. And so one of the big cases that people might remember of this was back in 2017, 2018, James Damore was terminated from Google after he put out a public statement about basically the reasons that he believed there were not more women in tech. He was an engineer fired in 2017. Just 2 months ago, the parties agreed to dismiss the lawsuit, which is, lawyers speak for. There was some sort of settlement reached likely, and so there was a dismissal put on file with the court. But employers need to make sure that while they are trying to increase diversity, they're not excluding others from opportunities. I mean, and that's really what the best way to make sure that you try to protect the employees that you currently have, while also creating an environment where everybody feels included and valued. So what does that have to do with board members? And I'm going to turn this over to Hillary. And Hillary, if you want to, just share with our attendees today too, why this is so important to you as a board member yourself.
Thanks, Chantel. I always rely on her for the legal thoroughness, because she is always on top of everything and applies it in such a practical way. And it's very important to me. I'm the president of a local nonprofit in Texas, and when we go to the task of recruiting new board members each year and looking at the list of candidates, it's fairly obvious to me when we're looking at the list that it's not diverse. And many of the boards rely upon their board of directors to bring in the pool of candidates. And when you're looking at that, you have to encourage your board members to go outside their comfort zones, to go outside their own social and professional networks, and to make a real effort at identifying a greater diverse pool of candidates, especially when either your social organization or if it is a corporation that is for profit is fully and candidly serving either your customers or the community. And the importance of a board, as the Fifth Supreme Court or Fifth Circuit Court recognized, is a corporation executes its business affairs by and is bound by the actions of its board of directors. The board of directors is the decision-making body at the highest level of organizational leadership, and the board itself plays a critical role in creating an organization that will prioritize, support, or invest in diversity, inclusion, and equity. And that should be something that a board is identified as the champion to lead the charge. And the board itself is not typically comprised of employees. Generally, it is volunteers for a nonprofit or identified candidates in the height of their professional careers for for-profit corporations. And except with the exception of some bylaws may require either a CEO or an executive director to sit on the board, in general, board of directors, when they're operating independently and they're not subject to an employer's control, they're not employees. However, there are certain factors to consider if your organization may uniquely be considered having its board of directors serve as employees. And that may become, like, for example, if there's a group of physicians that are on the board of directors but then also employees, it's difficult to define their roles as a board of director or an employee at each time. So this type of test that may come in as to whether the director is serving either as an employee at the time or as a director, which is not an employee, there's a 6-factor test. And generally what is this U.S. Supreme Court has said should be the relevant inquiry is whether the organization can hire or fire the director or set rules and regulations for that director's work, whether and if so, to what extent the organization supervises the director's work, whether the director reports to someone higher in the organization, whether and to what extent the director is able to influence the organization, and whether parties intended that the individual be an employee in a written agreement. And generally, typically, the board member is not considered an employee. Boards of directors are important because they are tasked generally with the power to hire and fire employees, to set the compensation for the CEO or executive director and other executives, and they also work to authorize or negotiate certain employment agreements. unless they delegate that specifically to a compensation committee. And the board of directors generally also will appoint, elect, and nominate other board members. So in looking at the powers of a board of directors and the highest level of the organizational leadership, recognize that they are at the top setting the tone for the entire cultural and employment mindset for the entire corporation or the nonprofit. So when the public is calling for, or when employees or the community is calling for change, why not identify the board as the champion to lead the change?
And Hillary, I'll say to that too. One of the things that this might also be useful in thinking about is I have had cases where the plaintiff is a CEO or a high-level person in the organization, and they are pointing to the board as the individuals who are responsible for discriminating against them, either in terminating a contract or believing they need to be removed, or even, say compensation, claiming that they were paid less than either their predecessor or successor because of some protected status. And so if you have a more diverse board, one, it helps on the defense side to identify that, individuals in the same class as that plaintiff were involved in the decision and can identify specific reasons why those decisions were made, rather than have a board that looks completely different than your plaintiff. Just create an image for the court and possibly a jury as to trying to defend against that claim.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You would completely exclude yourself from that type of defense. If you have, for example, an all-white board and a CEO that is a person of color, and there's an employment decision, because you look at the employment decision and the decision makers. And so, the Fifth Circuit found in Brown versus CSC Logic that when a person involved in the employment decision, for example, the board is a member of the same protected group, then courts recognize the unlikelihood that such persons are going to be perpetrators of discrimination against the members of their own class. So it's important to remember that as well. And I wonder if, Chantel, do you think it would be a compelling agreement or argument to be made if, for example, the board is also negotiating other executives' compensation, and maybe not necessarily decision making, but if the board is more diverse, also forestalling that type of discrimination claim by another executive?
I do, and I also think too, to the point that you raised earlier about oftentimes, your board is going to include people within the sphere of influence of your current board member. So if somebody rolls off the board and is being replaced, those being considered are typically, being considered because they already know somebody on the board. And so if your board is, in the example you gave, all white, and there is a person of color who is claiming, say, discrimination, well, one of the things that they will need to prove in order to make their case is that they were either replaced by somebody outside of their class or treated less favorably. The person outside their class was treated more favorably. And so, for example, if you have a CEO who is being terminated and claiming it's for a discriminatory reason, and it just so happens that your board is all white, and so everybody that they've considered to replace that CEO of color also happens to be white, while there may have been no discriminatory animus in making that decision and replacing that person of color with one of their peers, somebody that they knew, it would help the plaintiff make their case. And so the more diversity you have on your board, the more individuals you might be able to point to say who you considered and why, and identify what those qualifications were that really led to the reason that, say, that successor was chosen that had nothing to do with discrimination.
And even just going outside of hiring and firing a CEO and looking at the makeup of the board itself goes back to the very basics of how board members are choosing candidates and cultivating certain types of cultural awareness. So either as an HR professional or as an attorney, or even if you yourself are serving on a board, be it nonprofit or profit, encourage others to look for candidates with a variety of professional expertise and cultural backgrounds that would provide them with a spectrum of life experience and also geographic reach that can help the nonprofit or your corporation respond to future needs. And one caveat to encouraging board members to do that is that when you have a group or a team, their teamwork together and their ultimate intelligence is increased by their combined harmony of each person's strengths and talents, not just the sum of each individual's own personal potential. And it's how the people value each other on the team and know each other's strengths that also increases the effectiveness and productivity of the board working together as a team. And as we've stressed a number of times today, that the range of diversity increases and widens not only the talents, but also the continued networking and connectivity and how the board can productively and effectively respond to challenges and set strategy. And one way of doing that is to send it back to the board and to ask them to answer certain questions about what are the current strengths of the board and where could it be strengthened, and to really have the boards be involved and reflect on, are they just wedded to one familiar way that they've always done something, and in that just one continued strategy, are they closing themselves off or considering other innovative approaches that board members of color may be better positioned to introduce because they've either lived those experiences or they have different experiences from others on the board. And that would also include exploring and establishing new norms for each of the board members and how bringing aboard different diverse members would be mutually exclusive not only to the team and the board, but also to the nonprofit or the corporation that they serve. And it's something to do on a frequent basis when you want to ask the board to evaluate what measures they've done, and then also come back around again maybe 6 months later and really judge and evaluate how they've effectively implemented any measures that they've identified could be effective in cultivating new board membership. And that may have to involve some governance and changing some of the bylaws to change either the qualification or even possibly the number of board members so that they can actively implement any type of diversity strategy. Also, a board can consider what they want it to look like in the future and what the organization should look like in the future and who they want to serve and what customers, how can a for-profit corporation expand their consumer base? Would that be by bringing in new socioeconomic or other racial communities that they're not currently serving? And again, it's setting those goals and continuing to revisit those goals and how they have been implemented and evaluated. for example, board member qualifications may require that for a nonprofit organization that a board member donate a certain amount of money. And that is important, right? A lot of nonprofits are surviving only on funding and donations, and that's what they look to the board to do, is to increase funding. But one potential creative solution to that would be make some board seats available that do not require the specific threshold of funding. You know, some boards have a requirement that all board members either get or give, say, $2,500 a year, and that could potentially exclude a large base of potential candidates that could bring quite a lot of services in their own skill set to the board, but it would forestall a lot of potential candidates. So look back at your bylaws and your qualifications and consider how flexible they can be in order to make those board positions more available.
And I would say too to that, Hillary, if that is something that an organization is considering, you know, it would be important to make sure that board members that, you know, or applicants that they would consider who can't make that financial contribution still be a board member at the same level, because we're not just talking about having them present. You would want them to be given the opportunity to equally participate and have their voices heard. You know, there's a lot of conversation about the difference between diversity and inclusion, or, you know, inclusion and equality. And so that's something else to consider.
Yeah, and that rolls right into the next point of, even after you have selected and appointed your new board members, you want to continue to, with onboarding and orientation, there is a learning curve there, either whether it's a for-profit corporation or nonprofit, of that board member learning about the organization and how best to serve it. And so that begins with inclusivity and making sure that everybody's voice is heard. For example, it was 2017. There was a panel discussion, and Uber board members were invited to that discussion. And at the meeting, the female board member, Ariana Huffington, made the comment that when there's one woman on a board, often it leads to more women joining a board. And in response to that comment, one of the male board members responded, actually, it just shows that leads more likely to be more talking. And the attendees at the panel discussion were aghast at that exchange and the male's response as far as characterizing women about talking more. And especially at the time, Uber was trying to overcome a series of scandals related to sexual harassment claims. So following that response, Uber called for the resignation of that male board member. That is just one example. When you do have the initiative to bring aboard members that are more diverse, either by gender, disability, race, or socioeconomics, when you bring aboard that member has to feel included and safe and confident in voicing their opinions and their perspectives. And a lot can happen at the very beginning with orientation and a warm welcome and a continued collegiality between the board members to act as a team. And sometimes that starts, again, with the training and orientation and continues on, either whether it be social activities or continued professional development between the board members. But it's important to include all new board members from the very beginning.
Absolutely. So the common saying is diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And there are a number of variations of that. We asked another person who works in, the founder of Higher Strategies, who works in specifically diverse marketing efforts, she says that a strategic diversity and inclusion plan increases employee engagement, a company's reputation, and earnings through innovation. There are a lot of reasons to consider creating a diversity initiative, whether it's just among board members, where you have volunteers, where you're less concerned with potential violations of Title VII. But there's certainly an opportunity, if there is a need to correct disparities, correct an imbalance, a historical imbalance, as the case law says, to consider doing so within your, a company as well. And so we're glad that everybody's joined us today. There was a lot to go through in our short time together, but I think a lot of the takeaways are to consider the impact of Title VII on any decision that your company or organization might be considering when it comes to creating a diversity initiative. A targeted hiring effort is different than, say, having an affinity group within your organization that allows people to know each other and is more targeted towards retention than you are talking about something where you are specifically seeking out candidates for open positions where you run the risk of somebody later filing suit because they feel as though a less qualified individual was hired over them in the context of a potentially reverse discrimination claim. But you may also see, if companies and organizations don't take this to heart now, the minorities who are already in their organizations, whether they be racial, gender, or orientation-based, considering whether or not their failure to succeed in that organization or rise to the ranks has anything to do with a discriminatory animus. And we'll look to see what that organization or company is doing now, especially in light of just everything going on in the world and the conversations that people are having at home and at work, what they're doing and how that might impact the case of discrimination brought against your organization or company. So whether you're a decision maker or you're reporting to one, we understand that there's a lot to consider. And everybody, of course, wants to be careful and make sure that they don't run afoul of the law. Title VII, 1981 being the ones that are going to really rule the day as to whether or not you can take the action you want to and what steps you want to make sure you comply with and factors that you consider. And then, of course, as Hillary mentioned, in trying to create opportunities for diversity on the board, what steps you need to take, what changes might need to be made to bylaws, to requirements for contributions to the organization, especially in the nonprofit context, and making those changes meaningful by making sure that the board members have the training, have opportunities to know each other, to present their ideas, and really aren't just there to look like an effort. It's not performative, but it's intentional, it's real, and it is made to have the full benefit of your diverse board and all of the thought of the individuals that are on it.
Yeah, and if you're an HR professional and you're consulted about agenda items for the next board meeting, set this one up and provide. Board Source is a good resource for diversity trainings and questions that can be posed to the board, and possibly setting up a committee just for nominating and setting out a diversity strategy. So if that's not something that has already been addressed, it should, and something that the public is calling for, even though maybe legally you're not required to report it to the SEC if you're a for-profit corporation.
Absolutely. The next webinar will be a popular one, I'm sure. It is back to our COVID-19 series, Return to Work Issues Every HR Person Needs to Know. That will be August 20th from 12 to 1, and you will receive a link to register if that is a topic that you're interested in. And thank you again. We're just so happy you were here today and that we had a chance to discuss this important issue with you. And if you have follow-up questions, I think we've gotten a couple, and I know that they're actually going to take more time to follow through with, and we have time left today. So we will reach out to you individually via email to respond to your questions. But our contact information is on this last slide. You can reach me at ccheatham@thompsonco.com and Hillary@hlynch@thompsonco.com. And just please reach out to us if you have any questions about anything discussed today. Thank you again.
Thank you.